Karath was small. That was the first thing anyone noticed about him. Not his scales, which were a deep shade of charcoal gray with faint blue lines running along his spine. Not his eyes, which were sharp and golden even when he was too weak to lift his head. Just his size. He was small, and in the world of the Dracari, small meant worthless. The Dracari were a proud dragon species. They were tall, powerful, and loud. Their wings could block out the light of 2 suns when fully spread. Their roars could shake the walls of metal stations and make lesser species step back without thinking. They had built starships, conquered trade routes, and seated themselves at the top of every interspecies council they had ever joined. They did not do small. They did not accept small. And they certainly did not keep small. Karath had been born small. A dwarf dragon, the healers had said, like it was a diagnosis for something already dead. His clutch brothers and clutch sisters had hatched strong and loud, cracking their shells with powerful forearms and filling the hatchery with proud little roars. Karath had hatched quietly. He had pushed through his shell slowly, one small claw at a time, and when he finally came out, the room had gone very still. Nobody celebrated. His assigned handler, a broad-shouldered Dracari named Gon, had looked at him for a long moment and said nothing. The senior healer had written something down on a data pad and left without making eye contact. Even the other hatchlings, too young to understand anything, had shuffled away from him in the nest as if they could already sense he did not belong. Karath had grown up understanding one thing very clearly. He was a burden. He was too small to train with other young Dracari. Too weak to keep up on flight drills. His wings worked but only just. He could get off the ground, hover for a short time, and land. That was it. No speed. No height. No power. Other young dragons his age were already gliding between station platforms for fun. Karath watched them from below, sitting on the ground with his wings folded tight against his sides. Gon had taken care of him in the way someone takes care of a task they resent. Food was placed in front of him without warmth. Medical checks were done quickly and without words. When Karath made any sound, a small chirp, a low rumble, Gon would look at him with flat eyes and walk away. By the time Karath was old enough to understand what the word liability meant, he had heard it used to describe him more times than he could count. The day Gon left him at Waystation Drev 4 was a cold morning by station standards. The air recyclers were running loud and the overhead lights were flickering in the holding bay, a long gray room that smelled of metal and something faintly sour. It was the kind of place where creatures were kept between places. Not a home. Not a destination. Just a waiting room for things that had somewhere else to be. Karath had no somewhere else. Gon had walked him in on a short lead, unclipped it, and set a small bag of dried food beside him. He had not looked at Karath when he did it. He had not said anything. He had simply turned, walked to the bay door, pressed his hand to the exit panel and left. The door sealed shut with a soft hiss. Karath stood very still for a long time. He waited. He thought Gon might come back. Maybe he had forgotten something. Maybe there had been a mistake. Karath sat down on the cold floor, tucked his tail around his feet and watched the door. The door did not open. An hour passed, or what felt like an hour. The holding bay began to fill with other creatures being moved through the station. A pair of large insect-like beings with 6 legs were guided in by a handler who spoke to them gently and checked their conditions before leaving. A heavy, slug-like creature was rolled in on a flat platform, sleeping. A group of small bird creatures were placed in a cage unit in the corner, chirping constantly. Nobody looked at Karath. One alien handler walked past him twice. The second time she glanced down, saw what he was and kept walking. A Dracari traveler moving through the station noticed him from the doorway and made a short sound of disgust before moving on. A young alien child pointed at Karath and asked its parent what that small dragon was doing there. The parent pulled the child away without answering. Karath curled into himself. His wing hurt. It had been hurting for a while now, a deep ache in the left joint that got worse when the temperature dropped. The station was cold. He tucked both wings as close to his body as he could manage and pressed himself against the wall, which was not warm either but felt better than sitting in the open. He ate a little of the dried food Gon had left. It tasted like nothing. He stopped after a few bites. By the second day he had stopped watching the door. By the third day he had stopped eating. The pain in his wing had moved up into his chest, a tight heavy feeling that made breathing feel like work. He kept his eyes open because closing them felt dangerous somehow, like if he stopped watching the room something worse would happen, though he could not have said what. He just kept his golden eyes open and watched the walls and breathed slowly and waited for nothing in particular. It was on the 4th morning that the human came in. Karath did not know much about humans. He had seen them occasionally at the station, small soft creatures that moved quickly and talked a great deal. The Drakri did not think much of them, too fragile, too emotional, too fond of interfering in things that were not their concern. Karath had never had a reason to think about them one way or the other. This one was a female. She was not tall, even by human standards. She had dark hair pulled back from her face and wore a plain gray uniform with a small badge on the front. She carried a bag over one shoulder and a scanner in her other hand. She walked into the holding bay at a steady pace, already reading something on her scanner, and began moving from creature to creature doing checks. She was quick and calm. She spoke to each animal as she worked, not loudly, just a low steady voice that seemed to settle the room slightly. The bird creatures stopped chirping when she checked their cage. The insect beings went still under her hands. Then she reached the far wall. She almost passed him. Her eyes were on her scanner, her mind clearly on the next item on her list. But something made her slow down. She looked up. She saw Karath pressed against the wall, wings folded, eyes open, not moving. She stopped. She looked at him for a moment. Not the quick, disgusted glance he had gotten from others. A real look. Her eyes moved over him carefully. His size, his posture, the way he was holding his left wing, the untouched food beside him. She took one step toward him. Karath pulled back against the wall. Every muscle in his small body went tight. The human did not stop moving, but she slowed down completely. She lowered herself as she walked, getting smaller, bringing herself down to his level. By the time she reached him, she was almost kneeling, one knee on the cold floor, her head only a little above his. She said something. He did not know the words. But her voice was quiet and low, and she was not rushing, and she was not looking at him like he was a problem or a waste or a broken thing that someone else had left behind. He did not know what she was saying. He did not care. He snapped at her hand. It was not a hard snap. He barely had the energy for it. But his teeth caught the edge of her fingers, and he held for 1 second before letting go, expecting her to pull away, expecting her to stand up and leave like everyone else had. She did not pull away. She held still. She made a soft sound, more breath than word. She kept her hand exactly where it was. Her eyes stayed on him, calm, steady, and something else that Karath had no name for because he had never seen it directed at him before. She stayed. Karath looked at her hand. He looked at her face. His chest hurt and his wing hurt and the floor was cold and he had not eaten in 3 days. He did not snap again. He just looked at her, this small soft human kneeling on the floor of a gray holding bay, and for the first time in his short painful life, something in the room felt different. He did not know what it was yet. But he did not look away. Nora did not ask for permission. That was something her colleagues had learned about her a long time ago. She did not wait for approval before doing what she believed was right. She did not pause to check if the paperwork was in order when a living creature was sitting in front of her in pain. She assessed, she decided, and she moved. So when she saw Karath pressed against that cold wall, wings tight, breathing shallow, golden eyes watching her with equal parts fear and exhaustion, she did not go find a supervisor. She did not consult a regulation booklet. She unzipped her carry bag, pulled out a soft thermal wrap she kept for small animal emergencies, and gently, slowly, laid it across his back. He flinched. But he did not snap again. She took that as a yes. Getting him to the clinic was not simple. Karath was small for a dragon, but he was still a dragon. He weighed more than he looked, and he did not want to be carried. When Nora tried to slide her arms under him the first time, he pulled away and pressed harder into the corner, his left wing trembling with the effort of holding itself tight. Nora sat back on her heels and waited. She had learned that with frightened animals, patience was not optional. It was the only tool that actually worked. You could not rush a scared creature into trusting you. You could only make yourself as small and as calm and as unthreatening as possible, and then you waited for them to decide. She sat on the cold floor of the holding bay and she waited. 3 minutes passed. Maybe 4. The bird creatures in the corner started chirping again. Somewhere further down the station a door banged shut and the sound echoed through the walls. Nora did not move. She kept her breathing slow and her hands open in her lap and her eyes soft, not staring directly at him but not looking away either. Karath watched her. Then very slowly he leaned forward and sniffed her sleeve. Nora stayed completely still. He sniffed again. His small nose moved up her arm to her shoulder. She could feel how warm his breath was against her neck, which told her something already. A fever, maybe, or the body working too hard to fight something it was losing against. He pulled back and looked at her face. She looked back. He made a sound. Low and very quiet, something between a hiss and a breath. Then he stepped forward onto her knee. Nora moved slowly, one arm at a time, and gathered him against her chest. He was tense for the first few seconds, every muscle ready to fight. Then the warmth of her body reached him through the thermal wrap and something in him gave slightly, like a knot loosening one turn. She stood carefully and walked out of the holding bay. The bridge care clinic was 2 levels up and 3 sections across the station. It was not a large space. For examination tables, a wall of medical equipment, a supply cabinet that was always slightly disorganized no matter how many times Pete Larkin reorganized it, and a back room with a cot where Nora had slept more times than she could count. Pete was at the front desk when she came in. He looked up, saw what she was carrying and stood immediately. "What is that?" he said. "Dwarf dragon," Nora said. "Abandoned in holding bay 4. Been there at least 4 days by the look of him." Pete came around the desk and looked at Karath more closely. Karath looked back at him with flat, tired eyes. "He bit you," Pete said, noticing the small marks on her hand. "Barely," Nora said. "Get table 2 ready." Pete opened his mouth, closed it again and went to get table 2 ready. This was also something her colleagues had learned. When Nora used that voice, "You got table 2 ready." She laid Karath down gently. He tried to get up twice. Both times she put one hand lightly on his back and said something quiet and he stopped trying, though he kept his eyes on the room like he was cataloging every exit. The examination took 40 minutes. What she found made her jaw tight. The left wing joint was infected. Not a fresh infection either. This had been building for weeks, maybe longer, untreated and ignored while whoever was supposed to be caring for him simply had not bothered. The joint was swollen and hot to the touch. When she pressed carefully around the edges, Karath made a sharp sound and his whole body went rigid, but he did not try to bite her again. His lungs were worse. The scanner showed reduced function on both sides, with fluid starting to collect at the base of the left lung. In a full-grown healthy dragon this would have been serious. In a small dwarf dragon who had not eaten properly in days and had been sleeping on a cold station floor, it was the kind of thing that quietly became fatal if nobody did anything about it. His weight was far below where it should have been. His scales, which should have had a faint natural shine, were dull and dry. His temperature was elevated. His eyes, though still sharp, had the slightly sunken look of a body that had been running on empty for too long. Nora stood at the examination table and looked at all of it and felt the particular kind of anger she felt when suffering was not an accident but a choice someone else had made. He had not been abandoned because there was no help available. He had been abandoned because nobody had wanted to give it. She was still looking at her notes when the clinic door opened and Sarah walked in. Sarah was the Drakari medical consultant stationed on Drev 4. She was tall even by Drakari standards, with dark green scales and the kind of posture that suggested she had never once questioned whether she belonged in a room. She consulted for bridge care on alien biology when needed, and she was genuinely good at her job. She was also, in Nora's experience, completely unbothered by things that Nora found unbothering impossible. She looked at Karath on the table. Her expression did not change. "I heard you pulled a dwarf dragon from the holding bay," Sarah said. "News travels fast," Nora said, not looking up from her notes. "This is a small station." Sarah moved closer and looked at Karath with clinical detachment. "Wing infection. Lung fluid. Malnutrition." She said each thing flatly like items on a list. "You already know what the outcome curve looks like for dwarf dragons with this profile." "I know what it looks like without treatment," Nora said. "Treatment will take weeks. Resources, time, medication." Sarah paused. "He was abandoned for a reason, Nora. His own kind made a decision." "His own kind made a bad one," Nora said. She finally looked up. Her voice was calm. It was the kind of calm that had a lot of weight behind it. "You can log your concern in the consultation notes if you want. I'll read it after I finish his treatment plan." Sarah looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked at Karath. Karath looked back at her with half-lidded golden eyes, too tired to be threatening, too stubborn to look away. Sarah made a short sound, turned and walked out. The door closed behind her. Pete, who had been very busy pretending to sort supplies in the corner, let out a slow breath. Nora was already writing the treatment plan. It was a long list. Anti-infection medication for the wing joint, delivered in doses small enough for his size. Respiratory support, which meant a warm humid section of the back room and a breathing treatment twice a day. A diet plan that started soft and small and built up slowly so his stomach could adjust. Warmth. Rest. Time. She worked until the station lights dimmed to their night setting. Pete fell asleep on the front desk chair around the 3rd hour. Nora kept going. At some point past midnight she mixed the first small meal, a warm soft paste of proteins and minerals, calibrated for a dragon his size, and brought it to where Karath was lying in the back room under 2 thermal wraps, eyes open, watching the ceiling. She sat beside him on the floor. She put a small amount of the paste on her fingers and held it out. He looked at her hand. He looked at her face. He did not move for a long time. Then he leaned forward, slowly, and ate from her fingers. It was a tiny amount. Barely anything. But Nora sat very still and let him take his time, and when he finished he stayed where he was instead of pulling away, and his eyes, still watching her, were just slightly less guarded than they had been that morning. She refilled her fingers and held them out again. He ate again. Outside the clinic the station hummed and the stars held still and the night shift went about its business. Inside, a human sat on a cold floor in the dark and fed a dwarf dragon one small careful bite at a time, and neither of them looked away. The second week was harder than the first. That was the thing nobody told you about healing. The first week ran on urgency. There was always something immediate to do, something to fix, something to respond to. The body was in crisis and the mind stayed sharp because it had to. But the second week was slower. The crisis had passed but the work had not, and that was where most people ran out of will. Nora did not run out of will. She was up before the station lights shifted to their morning setting. She mixed Karatha's first meal of the day in the small back room, adjusted the humidity level on the warm corner she had built him, and checked his temperature before she had even fully woken up herself. It had become a routine so automatic that her hands did it while her mind was still catching up. The warm corner had taken her 3 days to build properly. She had started with a salvaged heat panel from a broken equipment crate that Pete had found in the maintenance storage corridor. It was not meant for medical use but it put out a steady low warmth that was close enough to what a dragon Karatha's size needed. She had patted the floor with layers of insulation foam cut from old packing material and covered it with a soft liner from the clinic supply room. The walls of the corner were 2 upright equipment cases pushed together at an angle, which blocked the draft that came from the ventilation unit 3 meters away. It was not beautiful. But it was warm and it was his, and the first time Karath had walked into it on his own and curled up without being guided there, Nora had felt something loosen in her chest. The breathing treatments happened twice a day, morning and evening. Nora would sit beside him with a small vapor unit and keep her hand resting lightly on his side so she could feel his breathing pattern as the treatment worked. He had stopped flinching at her touch somewhere around day 5. Now he simply watched her while she worked, those gold eyes steady and unreadable, taking in every small thing she did with an attention that felt almost deliberate, like he was studying her for a reason he had not yet decided on. The wing treatment was the most delicate part. The infection in the joint had to be treated with a precise amount of medication. Too little and it would not clear, too much and it would damage the delicate tissue that held the wing structure together. Nora checked the joint every morning. She would run her fingers along the swelling, press gently at the edges to check the heat level, and compare it to the previous day's notes. Progress was slow. Some mornings it seemed like nothing had changed. Some mornings it seemed slightly worse. On those mornings she wrote more detailed notes and adjusted the dosage and did not let herself think about Sarah's flat voice saying outcome curve. Sam Ford noticed the notes first. Sam was Nora's longest-running colleague at Bridge Care. He had been with the organization for 6 years, which was 3 years longer than Nora, and he approached most situations with the kind of calm that came from having seen a great number of things go wrong and surviving all of them. He was good at his job and he was good to work with and he worried about Nora in the specific quiet way of someone who knew better than to say it too directly. He said it on a Tuesday morning, station time, when he came in early and found her already at her notes with a cold cup of something that was supposed to be coffee sitting forgotten beside her elbow. "You slept here again?" he said. "I slept in the back room," she said. "That's different. The back room has a cot that is approximately as comfortable as the examination table. The examination table is fine. I've slept on it." Sam pulled up a chair and sat down across from her. He looked at the notes, at the cold coffee, at the slight shadows under her eyes. He did not say anything for a moment. "How is he?" he said finally. "Better," Nora said. "Slowly. The wing infection is responding. Lungs are clearer than last week. He's eating more." "Good," Sam said. "That's good." He paused. "You know you can share the treatment rotation. I can do the evening checks." Pete offered too. "I know," Nora said. "But you're not going to," Sam said. Nora looked up from her notes. She thought about how to explain it and then decided that Sam, of all people, probably already understood it and just wanted her to say it out loud. "He doesn't know you yet," she said. "He barely knows me. Every time a new face comes in he goes tight and still and watches the door. He's waiting for the next bad thing." If I change the routine now, if different people start coming in at different times, he's going to spend all the energy he needs for healing on being afraid instead. Sam looked at her for a long moment. All right, he said. He stood up and picked up her cold coffee and went to make her a fresh one. That was his way of saying he understood and also that he was going to keep watching anyway. Nora went back to her notes. The diplomat arrived on a Thursday. His name was Raud and he was Dracary, broad and dark-scaled with the particular kind of unhurried movement that powerful people used to remind everyone around them that they had nowhere they urgently needed to be. He was passing through Drev 4 on official trade business and had apparently heard, as everyone on the small station eventually heard everything, that a human vet had pulled a dwarf dragon from the holding bay and was treating it in the bridge care clinic. He came to see for himself. Nora was doing Karatha's midday meal when Raud appeared in the clinic doorway. She heard Sam's voice at the front desk and then the sound of footsteps that were heavier than anyone on her team, and she looked up to find a Dracary diplomat filling most of the doorway to the back room. He looked at Karath. Karath looked back at him. Whatever Raud had been expecting, it was clearly not what he saw. Karath was sitting upright on his padded floor in his warm corner. His scales had their faint shine back. His eyes were bright. He was watching Raud with the same steady attention he gave everything, and there was no cowering in it, no pressing into walls. Raud was quiet for a long moment. Then he looked at Nora. You treated him yourself? I did, Nora said. Dwarf dragons do not typically recover from secondary lung infection, Raud said. This one did, Nora said simply. He's not finished yet, but he's recovering. Raud looked back at Karath. Something moved behind his eyes that was hard to name. Not warmth exactly. More like the particular discomfort of a fixed belief meeting an inconvenient fact. You understand, Raud said carefully, that Dracary law classifies dwarf dragons as a discontinued lineage. Claiming one could create legal complications for your organization. Nora set down the meal container and looked at Raud directly. I'm not claiming him, she said. I'm making sure he doesn't suffer alone. Those are different things. Raud had no immediate answer for that. He looked at Karath one more time then turned and left. Sam appeared in the doorway 2 minutes later with his eyebrows raised. That went fine, Nora said before he could ask. It was a quiet afternoon 3 days after Raud's visit when it happened. Nora was sitting beside Karath doing his wing check, running her fingers along the joint the way she did every day. The swelling had gone down significantly that week. The heat in the joint was almost normal. She was making notes and talking to him in a low voice the way she always did, not because he understood the words but because the sound seemed to help, when she felt him shift beside her. She looked up. Karath was looking at his left wing. He was looking at it with an expression she had never seen on him before, focused and something underneath the focus that looked almost like determination. She went very still. He began to spread it. It was slow. It was clearly painful. The wing shook as it opened, the joint trembling with the effort, and a sound came from low in his throat that was quiet and strained. It did not open fully. It did not even open halfway. But it opened. Nora did not move. She did not speak. She sat on the floor of the back room of a small clinic on a station most people considered a stopover, and she watched a small dragon do something that everyone else had already decided he would never do. He held it open for 6 seconds. Then it folded back and he let out a long slow breath and he looked at Nora. She looked back at him. Yeah, she said quietly. That's it. His eyes stayed on hers and just for a moment the gold in them caught the light. The morning Consul Breck arrived. Karath was chasing a piece of insulation foam across the clinic floor. It had started accidentally. Pete had dropped a small square of packing foam while reorganizing the supply cabinet, and Karath had watched it slide across the smooth floor with sudden sharp attention. Then he had stepped off his padded corner, walked over to it and batted it with one forefoot. It skidded away. He followed it. He batted it again. Pete had stood very still so as not to break whatever was happening. For 10 minutes Karath had moved around the clinic floor, pushing the foam square, following it, occasionally pouncing on it with more energy than anyone had seen from him before. His left wing dragged slightly when he moved fast but it did not stop him. His gold eyes were bright and focused and there was something in his whole body that had not been there 3 weeks ago. A looseness, a willingness to simply be in the room without watching every exit. Nora had leaned against the doorway and watched and felt something quietly enormous in her chest. Then the front door opened and Consul Breck walked in and the room changed. Karath felt it before anyone else did. He stopped moving. The foam square slid away unnoticed. His body went back to the posture Nora recognized from the very first day, Tight, low, wings pulled in, eyes on the newcomer with the flat, careful attention of a creature that had learned to assess threats quickly. Breck was a different kind of Drackery than Raud. Where Raud had been heavy with quiet authority, Breck was sharp with active authority. He was not a large Drackery, but he carried himself like space belonged to him by right, and he moved through the clinic door like he had already decided the outcome of whatever was about to happen. He had two people with him. One was a young Drackery aide whose name Nora would later learn was Win. He was younger than Breck by a significant margin, with lighter scales and eyes that moved around the room with what looked like genuine curiosity rather than assessment. The other was a station official Nora recognized, a tired-looking human named Greg Holt who handled administrative disputes on Drev 4 and always seemed faintly unhappy about everything. Breck looked at Karath. His expression was the expression of someone looking at a piece of furniture they had been told was misplaced. He held out a document to Nora without looking at her. She took it. It was a formal Drackery property reclamation notice. The language was dense and official, but the meaning was simple. Karath was registered as Drackery biological property under Interspecies Transit Code. He had been documented as abandoned, but abandonment, under Drackery law, did not constitute release of species ownership. Now that the property had been, and here the document used a word that translated roughly as restored to functional condition, the Drackery consulate was exercising its right to reclaim. Nora read it twice. Then she looked up at Breck. "He has a name," she said. Breck looked at her for the first time. "The document is straightforward," he said. "The creature is Drackery property. We are here to collect it." "His name is Karath," Nora said. Her voice was completely level. "And he was left on this station to die. Your people put him in a cold holding bay with 3 days of food and walked away. Drackery resource allocation decisions are not subject to human emotional interpretation," Breck said. Greg Holt shifted uncomfortably near the door. Nora looked at the document again. She looked at Karath, who was pressed against the far wall now, watching Breck with the particular stillness of a creature that recognized something in the new arrival and did not like what it recognized. She looked back at Breck. "I need to consult with my organization's advisors before responding to this formally," she said. "The notice has a 72-hour response window," Breck said. He said it the way someone says a fact they know you cannot change. After that, the reclamation proceeds automatically under station transit law. He looked around the clinic once, briefly, in the way that made it clear he found the space small and unimpressive. Then he turned and walked out. Greg Holt gave Nora a look that was almost apologetic before following. The young aide Win was the last to leave. He paused at the door and looked at Karath for a moment, not with Breck's flat ownership gaze but with something more complicated, something that Nora did not have time to read before he turned and was gone. The clinic was quiet. Pete appeared from the supply room where he had been very still for the last several minutes. He looked at Nora. He looked at the document in her hand. "Can they do that?" he said. "Legally right now probably yes," Nora said. "So what do we do?" Nora set the document down on the examination table. She looked at Karath, who had not moved from the wall. She thought about the holding bay, the cold floor, the untouched food, the 4 days he had spent watching a door that never opened. She thought about the wings spreading in the afternoon light. She thought about a foam square sliding across a clinic floor and a small dragon following it with bright eyes. "We write it all down," she said. She started that evening. She had no legal training. She had no diplomatic standing. She was a veterinarian working for a small NGO on a mid-tier transit station, and she had exactly no power in any official interspecies framework. What she had was the truth, a clear memory, and the particular human stubbornness that refused to accept that those things counted for nothing. She wrote everything. She started from the beginning. The holding bay. The condition she had found him in. The 4 days alone. The wing infection that had been building for weeks before she ever saw him, meaning it had gone untreated while he was still in Drackery care. She described the lung fluid. She described his weight. She described the way he had flinched from hands and watched every door. She wrote about the treatment. Every day of it. Every adjustment to the medication, every breathing session, every meal. She included her clinical notes in full. She included Pete's observations. She included timestamps. She wrote about Raud's visit and his mention of legal complications and her response. She wrote about the foam square on the floor that morning. She wrote about what it looked like when a creature that had been waiting for the next bad thing started, slowly and carefully, to stop waiting. She submitted it to the Interspecies Ethics Council at 2 a.m, station time, under the category of welfare testimony, not as a legal challenge but as a record of what had happened and what it had meant. Then she went and sat with Karath in the back room. He was awake. He often was at night, old habits from a long time of sleeping lightly and watching for things that might come. He looked at her when she came in and settled beside him on the floor. She did not say anything for a while. She just sat there, close enough that he could feel the warmth of her and let the quiet be quiet. After a while he leaned slightly toward her. Not much. Just enough that his shoulder was against her arm. She did not move. The response from the Interspecies Ethics Council came 14 hours later, well inside the 72-hour window. They had reviewed the preliminary submission. Given the nature of the welfare claims and the documented timeline of abandonment versus reclamation, they were flagging the case for a formal hearing. The reclamation notice was suspended pending that hearing. A date would be set within 30 days. Pete made a sound when he read it that was somewhere between a laugh and a breath of relief. Nora read it twice, the way she had read Breck's document, and felt something that was not triumph. Triumph was too loud for what this was, but was solid and real and sat quietly in the middle of her chest. Breck's response came 20 minutes after that. It was formally worded and diplomatically phrased and contained, underneath all the careful official language, a level of fury that Nora could feel through the screen. He had not expected the submission to be accepted. He had walked into the clinic that morning already knowing the outcome, already calculating the transport arrangements, already treating the 72 hours as a formality. He had not accounted for someone simply writing the truth down. Sam read Breck's response over Nora's shoulder and said nothing for a moment. "He's angry," Sam said. "Yes," Nora said. "What happens now?" Nora looked through the open door to the back room where Karath was visible in his warm corner, gold eyes open, watching the ceiling with the calm of a creature who did not yet know that his fate had just been sent to a council of 14 species for consideration. "Now," Nora said, "we go tell the truth in a bigger room." The council hall on Station Varith 9 was not built to make anyone feel comfortable. That was not an accident. It had been designed by committee across 6 species 300 years ago, and the one thing all 6 species had agreed on was that the space should feel serious. The ceiling was high and curved, made of a dark composite material that absorbed sound in a way that made every voice feel small. The seats for council representatives rose in a wide arc, elevated above the central floor so that whoever stood in the middle was always looking up. The lighting came from strips along the upper walls, cool and flat, with no warmth in it. Nora had been in intimidating rooms before. She had presented difficult cases to skeptical review boards. She had stood in front of senior Drakkari officials and held her ground. But when she walked through the main doors of the council hall and saw all 14 representative seats filled, she felt the size of the room in a way that took a moment to breathe through. She breathed through it. Sam had offered to come with her. Pete had offered to come with her. She had told them both to stay with Karath and said it in a voice that did not leave much room for discussion. Karath had been moved to a secure holding room 2 levels below the council hall the previous evening, per council procedure for cases involving live subjects. She had checked on him that morning. He had been quiet and still and had watched her leave with his gold eyes tracking her all the way to the door. She was carrying a slim document folder and wearing her standard bridge-care uniform, which Pete had pressed carefully the night before and which had still managed to develop a crease along the left sleeve by the time she arrived. She had looked at it in the corridor mirror outside the hall and decided it did not matter. She was not here to look impressive. She was here to tell the truth clearly. She walked to the center of the floor and stood in the light. The 14 representatives looked down at her. She recognized some of them by species if not by face. The Drakkari seat was occupied by a senior council member she had not seen before, older than Breck, with gray edging on dark scales. Breck himself sat in the observer's section to the right, in a chair that was slightly outside the main arc, and his eyes were on her from the moment she entered the room. Elder Thien sat at the center of the arc. He was very old, from a species called the Vihari, small and pale with eyes that were almost entirely white and the particular stillness of someone who had sat in this room for a very long time and heard a very great number of things. He had been chair of the Ethics Council for longer than most of the stations on the current transit maps had existed. He looked at Nora with those pale eyes and said nothing and waited. A council administrator spoke first. She outlined the case in formal language. Drakkari property claim. Bridge care welfare submission. Suspended reclamation notice. The question before the council, whether the welfare testimony presented sufficient grounds to challenge the property claim under interspecies ethics code. Then she nodded at Nora. Nora opened her folder. She looked at the first page. Then she closed the folder. She had written it all down. She had prepared careful notes and organized arguments and specific references to interspecies welfare precedents that Sam had helped her find. All of it was in the folder. All of it was good. But standing in the middle of the floor under the flat cool lights with 14 species looking down at her, she understood that what this moment needed was not a prepared argument. She put the folder under her arm and she talked. She started with the holding bay. She described it the way she had seen it, the gray walls, the flickering lights, the cold floor. She described walking in with her scanner and doing routine checks and almost walking past him. She described the way he was pressed into the corner with his wings tight and his eyes open and his body doing the quiet, desperate work of staying alive without any help from anyone. She described the wing infection that had been building for weeks before she found him. She said that clearly and let it sit in the air of the room. Not a new injury. Not something that happened in the holding bay. Something that had been growing while he was still in the care of the people who were now in this room claiming ownership of him. She described the treatment. She did not make it dramatic. She just described it plainly, the medication schedule, the breathing treatments, the diet, the weeks of daily work. She described how he had flinched from hands. How he had watched doors. How it had taken days before he would eat and weeks before he stopped tensing every time a new person entered the room. She described the foam square on the floor. She said it simply. That on the morning the reclamation notice arrived, she had walked into her clinic and found her colleague standing very still while a small dragon chased a piece of packing foam across the floor with bright eyes. She said that was what recovery looked like. Not a medical chart. Not a scan result. A living creature using energy for something other than survival. The hall was quiet. She looked up at the Drackery Council seat. I am not a lawyer, she said. I am not a diplomat. I understand that there are codes and frameworks and precedents in this room that I am not qualified to argue. But I am qualified to tell you what I saw and what I did, and what the difference was between the two. She paused. He was left to die. I chose to help him. That is the complete history of my involvement. She stopped talking. The hall stayed quiet for a moment. Then Breck spoke from the observers section. His voice was controlled, but there was an edge under it that had not been there when he had simply been delivering a reclamation notice to a small clinic. He said that the testimony was emotional and anecdotal. He said that Drackery resource decisions regarding dwarf dragons were a matter of species' internal policy and not subject to external ethical review. He said that the human concept of individual animal welfare was a cultural preference and not a universal standard. He said it all in the smooth, structured way of someone who had prepared carefully and expected to win. Elderthine listened to all of it without moving. Then he looked at the council administrator and said something in a low voice. The administrator nodded and left through a side door. Nora stood on the floor and waited and did not know what was happening. 3 minutes passed. Then the side door opened again. Karath walked in. He was not supposed to be there. The procedure was clear. The live subject remained in the holding room until the council called for a formal presentation, which had not been scheduled until the following session. Nobody had called him. Nobody had brought him. Somehow, in a way that the 2 junior staff members outside his holding room would spend considerable time afterward trying to explain, he had simply walked out of the room and found his own way to the hall. He stood in the doorway for a moment. The hall was completely silent. 14 representatives looked at a small dragon standing in a doorway with a slight drag in his left wing and eyes that moved around the room once, quickly, the way they always did when he entered a new space, cataloging, assessing, deciding. Then his eyes found Nora. He walked. It was not fast. His left wing dragged slightly on the turns and his gait was uneven in the way it always was when he had been still for a while. The floor of the council hall was smooth and wide and it took him some time to cross it. Every representative watched him. Breck watched him. Elderthine watched him. Nobody spoke. Karath crossed the entire floor and walked to Nora and sat down beside her left foot and looked up at the council. Nora did not move. She did not reach down or make any gesture toward him. She just stood there with a small dragon sitting beside her boot, and she kept her eyes forward and she breathed slowly. Elderthine watched this for a long moment. Then he leaned forward slightly in his seat and spoke. His voice was low and carried easily in the quiet hall. He spoke in Old Drackery, the formal tongue, the language of binding questions that went back further than the council itself. The words translated, roughly, as, "Whom do you name as your firekeeper?" It was the oldest question in Drackery tradition. The one asked when a dragon chose who stood beside them. The one that could not be coached, could not be performed, could not be legally argued around. The entire hall looked at Karath. Karath looked at Nora. He did not look at the council. He did not look at Breck. He did not look at the Dracry representative or the observers or the high curved ceiling or the flat cool lights. He looked at Nora and he stayed where he was, and the answer was the simplest thing in the room. The hall took a long time to find its voice again. Elder Thien sat back in his seat after Karatha's answer and was quiet for almost a full minute. The other 13 representatives did not speak either. Some of them were looking at Karath. Some were looking at Nora. A few were looking at Breck, who was sitting in the observer's section with his hands flat on the table in front of him and his expression carefully, deliberately still. The kind of still that took effort. Elder Thien spoke to the council administrator in a low voice. Documents were passed along the arc. 2 representatives leaned toward each other and exchanged quiet words. The Dracry Council seat representative, the older one with gray edging on his scales, looked at Karath for a long time with an expression that Nora could not fully read but that did not look like the flat ownership gaze Breck had brought into her clinic. It looked more like someone doing quiet arithmetic on a belief they had held for a very long time. Nora stood in the center of the floor and waited. Karath sat beside her foot and waited too. He had not moved since he crossed the floor. He was not tense the way he used to be in new spaces. He was simply present, settled, in the particular way he had developed over weeks in the clinic, the way of a creature that had decided, carefully and on its own terms, that it did not need to be afraid of everything anymore. Elder Thien called the hall to attention. His voice was not loud but it reached every corner of the room without effort. He spoke first in the common trade tongue so that all parties could follow clearly. The council had reviewed the welfare testimony in full. The documented timeline showed clear evidence of untreated medical conditions predating the abandonment, which placed the subject's welfare in question prior to the point of reclamation claim. The property reclamation notice relied on the premise that the subject had been restored to functional condition as the basis for ownership reassertion. However, the council found that the framework of ownership itself could not be cleanly applied to a living subject who had demonstrated, in this hall and without prompting, a clear expression of preference and bond under the oldest recognized standard in Dracry formal tradition. Karath could not be owned by the Dracry consulate. He could not be owned by anyone. He was, under emergency welfare language drafted that morning by 3 council members working through the night, recognized as a free subject with the right to choose his own accompaniment and place of residence. Bridgecare and Dr. Nora Wells were named as his documented caregivers of record. Any future attempt to claim ownership or force relocation would be treated as a violation of the new framework. The ruling was entered into the permanent council record. Breck stood up. He did not shout. He was too composed for that, too trained in the formal spaces of diplomacy to lose himself completely. But he spoke in a sharp, tight voice that made his feelings very clear. He said the ruling was an overreach. He said the council had allowed human sentiment to compromise interspecies legal framework. He said the Dracry consulate would be reviewing its relationship with the Ethics Council's jurisdiction going forward. Elder Thien listened to all of it without changing his expression. Then he said quietly that the ruling stood. Breck gathered his documents and left. The sound of his footsteps crossing the hall floor was the loudest thing in the room for several seconds after the main doors closed behind him. Nora let out a breath she had been holding for what felt like the entire morning. She looked down at Karath. He looked up at her. His gold eyes were calm and bright and he made a low sound in his chest, very quiet, that she had come to recognize over the past weeks as his version of acknowledgement. Not quite contentment. Something more awake than that. Something that meant he was aware of her and had decided that was a good thing. She reached down and rested her hand lightly on his head. He did not flinch. She was still standing there when she heard footsteps approaching from the side of the hall. She looked up expecting Sam or the council administrator with paperwork, and found instead the young Dracry aide. When he was alone. He had separated from Breck's group sometime in the confusion of the exit and now he stood a short distance from Nora with his lighter scales and his eyes that moved around rooms with curiosity rather than calculation. He looked younger than he had in the clinic. Up close, without Breck beside him, he seemed uncertain in a way that sat honestly on his face. He looked at Karath for a moment. Then he looked at Nora. The ruling was correct, he said. His voice was quiet and he said it like someone saying something they had been thinking for a long time and had not had a safe place to put. Nora looked at him carefully. There are others, Wynne said. He kept his voice low, not conspiratorial but careful. Dwarf dragons. On 3 different Dracry stations that I know of. Some in holding situations. Some in conditions that are... He stopped. He seemed to be choosing his words with a kind of deliberate honesty that Nora recognized. The honesty of someone who had seen something wrong and could not unknow it. Not good, he finished. Nora was quiet for a moment. "How many?" she said. "At least 7 that I have personally seen documented," Wynne said. "There may be more." The number sat in the air between them. Nora reached into her document folder and took out a plain contact card, Bridgecare letterhead, her direct frequency, the clinic address on Drev 4. She held it out. Wynne took it. He looked at it for a moment and then looked at her. "Breck will not approve of this," he said. "No," Nora agreed. Something settled in Wynne's expression. Not quite a decision made, more like a decision that had already been made finding its footing. He put the card carefully into his inner jacket pocket. "I will be in touch," he said. He turned and walked out of the hall. Nora stood alone in the middle of the council floor for a moment, Karath beside her, the high ceiling above her, the empty seats of 14 species in a wide arc around the space where something had just changed. Then Sam's voice came from the main doorway, loud with relief. "Well," he called. "We won," she called back. The sound Pete made from somewhere behind Sam echoed off the composite ceiling in a very undignified way that Nora suspected the original hall designers had never anticipated. They left Station Verith 9 the following morning and were back on Drev 4 by midday. The docking bay was not a remarkable place. It was wide and practical, with high ceilings to accommodate ships of various sizes and a floor that was always slightly gritty from the residue of fuel processing. It smelled of metal and recycled air and the faint burned edge of engine exhaust. It was not scenic or peaceful or particularly clean. But it had space. And that afternoon, for the first time since anyone had begun paying attention to Karath, there was nobody in it except him and Nora and Sam and Pete, and the small alien child named Issa who had taken to appearing wherever Karath was with the quiet reliability of someone who had decided she belonged in that orbit. Issa sat in the doorway at the edge of the bay with her small legs folded under her, watching. Karath stood in the middle of the open floor. He had been looking at the ceiling for several minutes. His head was tilted back and his eyes were moving along the high space above him with an expression Nora had not seen before. Calculating, almost. Measuring the distance between the floor and the upper struts the way she had seen him measure the space between himself and a door. She took 3 steps back. Then 3 more. Sam and Pete moved without being asked, giving the center of the floor entirely to him. Karath spread his wings. Both of them fully for the first time since Nora had known him. The left one trembled slightly at full extension and the joint would probably ache by evening, but it held. It held and it was wide and in the flat light of the docking bay it was unexpectedly, quietly beautiful. The charcoal gray of his scales and the faint blue lines along the membrane catching the light in thin bright threads. He beat them once. Twice. On the 3rd beat he left the ground. It was not graceful. He went up at a slight angle, overcorrected, dipped on the left side and climbed again with more effort than elegance. He was not fast. He was not smooth. He reached a height of about 4 meters, wobbled dramatically, held himself there for a moment that felt enormous and then came back down. He landed heavily. His feet slid slightly on the gritty floor and he had to use his wings to catch himself, which he did, clumsily and completely successfully. He stood there breathing hard. Nora walked toward him slowly. She stopped in front of him and looked at him and he looked back at her with his gold eyes very bright and his chest heaving and his left wing still trembling slightly from the effort. He stepped forward and put his feet on her shoulders and his weight knocked her back half a step and she grabbed his sides to steady them both and laughed. It came out loud and real, not a polite sound but an actual laugh, the kind that came from somewhere below careful composure. Karath made a sound. It was not a sound anyone in the room had heard before. Not the low quiet acknowledgement hum from the clinic. Not the sharp warning sound from their first meeting. This was deep and warm and resonant, rising from somewhere in his chest and rolling out into the bay like something that had been waiting a long time for the right moment to exist. Pete stood very still. Sam put one hand over his mouth. Issa, in the doorway, smiled so wide that her whole small face changed shape. She did not say anything. She just sat there with her legs folded and her wide eyes bright and watched the human and the dragon in the middle of the docking bay with the particular joy of someone seeing something they had hoped was possible turn out to be true. Nora stood in the middle of the floor with a dragon on her shoulders and laughed until her eyes were wet and did not mind at all. Somewhere across the galaxy, 7 dwarf dragons were waiting in places that were cold and quiet and lonely. They did not know yet that someone had written their names down. They did not know yet that a contact card was sitting in a young aide's jacket pocket. They did not know that a human vet on a small station had just won a ruling in front of 14 species and was already, in the back of her mind, beginning to think about what came next. But that was the thing about humans. They did not stop. They won one fight and they looked for the next door and they walked toward it with worn uniforms and clear eyes and the specific stubborn belief that one person doing the right thing was always worth something, no matter how large the room or how loud the opposition or how many times they had been told that some creatures were simply not worth the effort. Karath had been left to suffer alone. Every single one of them would be found.